Today, I'm going to talk about wetlands, and I'm really excited to share with you my knowledge and an introduction to wetlands. I think I got so excited that I created a jam-packed presentation for all of you where we're going to skim the surface on all of these really great topics. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it. Today we'll talk about what makes a piece of land a wetland, why are wetlands so important, and how are wetlands conserved. So our first part, what is a wetland? I tend to joke a lot that of course they're lands that are wet, but wetlands do have a few more characteristics than that. These ecosystems tend to be that transitional zone between terrestrial and aquatic systems. And hydrology in water is very, very important, and that kind of leads all of the other characteristics that we have. So a wetland has these three characteristics. In fact, to identify a wetland, we need to make sure that there is proof of all three of these. Again, hydrology in water is leading these other characteristics as well. And that could be surface water or ponding, or certain wetlands may simply have a high water table where that water is at or near the soil surface. And this water creates a low oxygen condition or anaerobic condition that allows these hydric soils to form. And so that's just a fancy way of these very specific soils that form in our wetlands. And of course, our wetland plants, again, they are adapted to our low oxygen anaerobic conditions. They are water loving. They're not afraid to get their feet wet and be in the water. I use the iconic picture here of cattails because a lot of times when we see cattails, they're very indicative of these wetland ecosystems. So there are four types of wetlands that we kind of talk about: marshes, swamps, bogs, and fens. A lot of these are typically used interchangeably, but they are all different. And so we're just going to take a moment to kind of look at each of these different types of wetlands. So a marsh is dominated by sedges, rushes, and grasses. So all of those herbaceous vegetation covers and they can be tidal or non-tidal. And so in this picture, you can see that there is a lot of surface water in this wetland. And if this particular wetland were a tide, at high tide, we see that water. At low tide, we might actually see some of those mud flats and the sediment as the tide goes out. Non-tidal wetlands tend to be at the fringes of lakes or the edges of lakes or on the edges of big rivers. And they're not influenced by tide, but again, they have those same dominant herbaceous vegetation cover. Swamps are similar, but they are dominated by woody vegetation, and they can be trees or shrubs. Here's a photo of a shrub swamp. I think when I personally think of swamps, I think of the southeast and the cypress swamps in those areas. But it includes a lot of really iconic ecosystems like the Everglades and then mangrove forests as well. Bogs are peat-forming wetlands. They're a really interesting ecosystem. They tend to have more acidic water. They're covered in a thick moss layer as their substrate, as their vegetation, and they typically just get input from precipitation, and that really drives kind of the nutrients that are flowing in and out of this wetland or this system, and they tend to be really nutrient poor. Similar to bogs, fens are also peat-forming wetlands. But they tend to be less acidic. They tend to have higher nutrient levels, and this is a lot has a lot to do with the fact that they get water inputs in addition to precipitation. So there's a little bit more of water flowing in these systems. So I know I just gave you like the most basic introduction to what is a wetland, but I wanted to take a moment to kind of play a quick game with you guys. I wish we were in person because I would love to have some feedback from the audience, but unfortunately you get to hear my voice the whole time. So I'm going to show you a series of photos, and I just want you to think of the first thing that comes to mind. Is this a wetland? Yes or no? Don't need to overanalyze, just the first thing that comes to mind. And I'm just going to show you a series of photos. Again, I'll pause on each one of them for a few seconds, and then we'll continue on. So the question for all of these is this a wetland? We'll start with our first photo here. Again, just thinking of that first reaction that you have. Our next photo, is this a wetland? How about this photo? Or this one? Is this a wetland? And my last photo for you today of is it a wetland? Now, there's a reason why I didn't put any of the captions of these photos on this particular set of slides, is because they're all wetlands. And if you saw the captions, you would probably be able to determine that every single one was a wetland. I hope nobody is feeling betrayed by my little exercise here. The biggest point that I'd like to have all of you take home is that wetlands are very diverse. They look very different across the entire country, across the landscape, and even to a really trained eye, it's hard to just determine based on a photo. We talked about needing hydrology, plants, and soil, and some of those things we can't actually check unless we're on the site. So I just wanted to reiterate that sometimes identifying wetlands can be really tricky. They can be so tricky that the Army Corps of Engineers actually created a wetland delineation manual, and this was the first step at trying to get scientists all on the same page so that they're all identifying the exact same resource the same. And it was a great first step. However, this first iteration was the entire country. They had one manual for the entire country. And so it didn't take very long for them to realize that there were different wetlands and different ecosystems across the country, and they split up, they created manuals for every single region or these different regions of the country. And I'll just zoom in here to this map that is in the manual and the supplemental manuals that they put together. And we can see in our little slice of Washington, we are technically in what they call the arid West. And as we move either north or west, we get into the western mountains, valleys, and coasts. And if you've driven across the state, you can probably think to yourself, that makes a lot of sense. So these different regions just have different indicators and ways to identify so that we're all identifying these ecosystems the same. The other really cool thing that is out there for us to use, and this is a public tool, the National Wetland Inventory was created by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. This has been a long time in the making to create an inventory for the entire country. And it's really cool because if you just Google National Wetland Inventory, you can see the mapper that they've created, and you can zoom into wherever you want to in the country. For today, I just kind of zoomed into somewhere we may know. So I zoomed into Steptoe Butte, trying to just see what on the map it has. And this is kind of how it looks. You'll see there are these different features on the map as you begin to zoom in. And then you can also start to click on these features. So we can see that there's some headwater streams coming off of Steptoe, and then we see some of these features as well. And so if I click on one of them, it identifies it as a freshwater pond. It tells us what the classification is, and it gives us a whole bunch of detail of that type of wetland and what can be found there, or that typical ecosystem. The one caveat about this inventory is that it does not include every single wetland on the landscape. It would be amazing if we had a tool like that, but unfortunately, this is exactly that. It is one tool that we can use to try to identify wetlands. The other caveat, because it's not accurate, it goes the other way. If we go out there to a place where this map says there's a wetland, there's a potential that there will be no wetland there, that it was misidentified. Maybe it was a historical wetland, or maybe it was just a depression where we thought water was going to actually collect and it just never did. So again, as you, if you go and start exploring with this tool, just know that this is kind of a step in the right direction, but definitely still need to go out and ground truth these types of wetlands. So I'm going to transition from the identification of wetlands straight into why wetlands are important. We know there's a lot of diversity. We know that they are throughout the entire landscape. What makes them so important? So we talk about functions, and we're talking about the process or series of processes that take place within a wetland. And before I go into these points here, I just want to reiterate, because wetlands are so diverse and they are found throughout the watershed or the landscape, not all wetlands are created equal, and not all wetlands are at the same value, if you will. They might be degraded, they might be pristine, they might be a really small wetland at a headwater spring, or they could be a coastal wetland that's taking in a lot of water. So as we talk about these functions, some wetlands don't have every single function, but we do see a lot of these functions overlapping in the different types of wetlands. One big thing that wetlands do is retain sediment and nutrients. And in this diagram, you can kind of see that there is a stream at the top of that hill slope, or maybe it's just a channel where water kind of starts to run down that hill, and it runs into this wetland. And what happens when this happens, the water starts to dissipate over this area, and the velocity of that water slows down. And when that velocity slows down, the sediment that is contained in the water and the nutrients that are contained in the water or bound to that soil starts to settle down to the bottom. And we can see that kind of filtration happening in this wetland. It's also a really good way to store water on the landscape. We get a lot of water within a watershed, and that eventually drains into a large river or a large body of water or ocean. And so these wetlands allow us to hold on to that water a little bit longer. And because of that, some wetlands are actually located in areas where surface water is actually able to enter our aquifer and allows us to recharge that groundwater through those new inputs. And so having this water pooling in certain areas is really beneficial. Wetlands are really also a great carbon source. All that vegetation is taking all of the atmospheric carbon that's in our air and storing it into that vegetation. And so we see a lot of carbon sequestration and storage within these really productive wetlands. And of course, fish and wildlife habitat. As these wetlands become really productive with sediment and nutrients, we see bacteria and insects and waterfowl and frogs and a whole host of organisms that really enjoy this type of habitat. So functions are the processes, and values are the benefits that we see, whether it's for our own benefit or for a landscape benefit. Wetlands really do a lot of work for us. And number one is that improving water quality, and that goes straight back to that sediment and nutrient retention. It's basically being a really big sponge and filter for sediment, for nutrients, before it gets into those larger bodies of water. Another thing is stream bank and shoreline protection. Here in this photo, they've started to replant a section of this wetland that is along a bigger river. And all of those living roots with that native vegetation is going to hold on to the soil in that bank, and whatever may come to that bank, whether it's tidal waters, whether it's really fast moving, high velocity water, it's going to help protect that bank. And then, of course, wetlands help us reduce flood risk. It sounds kind of counterintuitive because we think of wetlands being flooded areas or ponded areas, but these wetlands allow water extra space or room to be stored. And so instead of just starting at the top of our watershed and going straight down to the stream at a high, during a high precipitation event, it's getting caught up in those wetlands and stored, and allowing that water to have a much natural flow regime than just a flood incident. So wetlands can really help us reduce flooding and are really important to development and infrastructure. And then, of course, all of the values that we get to benefit in: recreation, hunting and fishing, of course, biodiversity and aesthetics. I think there are a lot of wetlands out there that are very picturesque that we can think about, that we enjoy visiting and spending time in. So these are more of those benefits that we personally get to enjoy. Unfortunately, the sad part about wetlands is that we have lost a lot of wetlands over the past many years. There's so many statistics out there of how many acres we used to have and how many acres we have now and how many we've lost in a certain amount of time. But I'm going to just give you a few here. 60% of the wetlands worldwide have been destroyed or impaired. Over half of America's wetlands have been lost since 1780. And of course, that wetland loss continues today, or there's still threats today. And from 1950 to the 1970s, we saw a really big boom in growth in our country, but that also meant we saw a lot of loss in wetlands too. And so just some of the historic reasons that wetlands have been lost, there's just a lot of development that's happened, whether it's urban development or as we started to move across the country and into these western states. We've seen a lot of wetlands be impaired. Agriculture, dams and levees. We started constructing dams, and maybe they didn't necessarily impact them directly where a wetland was removed, but changing the flow regime has the potential of also impacting wetlands. Of course, pollution. Historically, peat extraction was really a popular way to fuel historically, and so they were using the peat that they found in wetlands. Groundwater pumping, logging has been detrimental to our wetlands as well. And of course, this is all what I'm talking about, historically, but we do still see these similar threats. And of course, one of the big threats is hydraulic alterations, and that could be draining a wetland or filling in a wetland, diverting flow, maybe not intentionally to dewater a wetland, but a project that you were working on ended up changing that flow to wetlands. We have seen stream channelization historically, and this photo that I'm showing here is kind of the opposite of stream channelization. It's showing back in the day when there was a straightened stream and a restoration project that started in the 90s to try and re-meander the stream. But I want to show this because it's a really good way to see how different the landscape is between a straightened stream channel and something that has these natural meanders. That straightened stream channel doesn't have too much of a riparian buffer or a floodplain, whereas stream channels that are able to naturally meander may have wetlands, may have an active floodplain. And so any change in that alteration to the hydrology can result in a loss of wetland. The other thing that we still see today is pollution from urban centers to agriculture, even mining. I worked in a mining area of Pennsylvania, and that's definitely still a threat today in our country. And then, of course, removal of vegetation. So now we get to talk a little bit about the fun part of wetland conservation. So it's not all bad news. There is work to protect these wetlands and restore these wetlands. I'm gonna break this talk into the protection of wetlands and the restoration separately. So protection, preserving an actual current wetland so that we continue to have them function as they were intended to, and restoration, which is enhancing wetlands to improve those functions. So the first part of talking about protections, we have to talk about regulations. And I apologize, this is probably a pretty dry section of my presentation. I'm going to talk about some laws, the protections of wetlands, and that will kind of then transition into restoration. So bear with me. I am going to get into some laws here. So first, we'll talk about the federal regulations. Back in 1899, there was the Rivers and Harbors Appropriation Act. And this was almost the first really big act that included wetlands, even though not a lot of wetlands or types of wetlands were included in this act. So this is kind of like that first step. And this act prohibited the obstruction of navigable waters. And so it also defined navigable waters as those that were either influenced by the tide or provided some sort of commerce or importance to commerce. And so as you can imagine, some of the wetlands that were protected in this may be those coastal wetlands, or maybe some of the wetlands that are located within a river channel or a floodplain. So it was very limiting to the protection of those wetlands up until the Clean Water Act of 1972. And the Clean Water Act has these two sections, Section 404, which regulates the discharge of dredge and fill materials into the waters of the United States, which includes wetlands. And I highlighted waters of the United States because if you've kept up with any current events in the past few years, this definition of waters of the United States has been debated and talked about a lot. And so we think about streams and water bodies being protected. wetlands fall into a very similar protection because we think of them as these waters of the United States. And then in section 401, this is the state certification of water quality. And it was basically the federal government trying to get states to also pass more regulation to protect these wetlands. State regulations here in the state of Washington, Department of Ecology is the agency that's responsible for regulating wetlands. They issue permits and they actually put together a wetland identification system. Basically ranks a wetland to determine the function of that wetland or the value of that wetland. And that really is important for that permitting process. Washington state laws that allow Department of Ecology to be that state agency is the Water Pollution Control Act and the Shoreline Management Act. As we go further into local regulations, the Growth Management Act required local governments to develop policies or regulations to protect critical areas. And as you guessed, wetlands are a critical area. So a lot of counties have these critical area ordinance or another document that's outlining that specific regulation for critical areas. Here in Whitman County, that's all managed by the Whitman County Planning Department. And then agricultural regulations. I wanted to touch on this really briefly because obviously we are in a very high agricultural region, and wetlands have always been kind of a topic with agriculture. And in 1985, the Farm Bill actually included a lot of provisions, and one of them was the Wetland Conservation Compliance provision. And I have a feeling that this is kind of in response to that Clean Water Act. And basically, they realized that they need to be following regulation in agricultural areas. And so part of that is identifying these areas that are previously converted wetlands, and basically agricultural wetlands that were converted prior to that Farm Bill continue to be agricultural converted wetlands. So those are still in agriculture and they are still managed today. Farmed wetlands are those that were converted after 1990. And after 1990, any wetland on an agricultural piece of land had to follow federal regulations. So today, if I decided that I wanted to buy a piece of land, and maybe it wasn't historically agriculture, but I wanted to start a small scale agricultural production, if there's a wetland on there, I still need to go and follow all those federal regulations. So I just wanted to point this out because it is something that's really pertinent to our area here. So just to recap on a regulation, again, kind of the dry part of laws and things surrounding wetlands, but wetlands are regulated at the federal, state, and local levels. Wetlands cannot be filled or dredged, at least absolutely not without a permit. And then agricultural wetland regulation really depends on when that farming activity started on a piece of land. And so with federal regulation, there comes a certain amount of mandatory protection that wetlands have because of these laws and regulations. And so I want to touch on this just very quickly. Any type of work typically requires the identification of floodplains, waterways, wetlands before any type of construction project, and to follow those permitting requirements. And when we talk about permitting, we're talking about permitting for any type of water body, whether it's a stream or a lake or a river. we kind of think, I think typically those protections, because not a lot of us are expecting to build a house on the top of a river. But wetlands have those same regulations. And so it's really important to understand that they're protected the same way. So any construction project that is going to impact a wetland will typically require some sort of mitigation plan. And a mitigation plan is basically the plan to offset the impacts to the wetland. So if your project is going to impact a ½ acre of a really amazing wetland, the permit and the agency is going to determine what you need to do in order to offset that. And I just included this figure here. It's one that I found for a project where they were impacting 2 acres of wetlands. And this was their map and their proposal to restore or create up to 4 acres of wetlands to offset what was impacted. And so a mitigation plan may include plantings. It may include more of a restoration to bring back hydrology, but that mitigation plan is based on kind of that permit and what that agency decides. The other thing that I think is really interesting and wanted to just point out is critical area ordinances typically have a buffer zone around wetlands where work can't occur. And this figure was actually put together by Thurston County here in Washington. And I think it does a really good job at showing what that means. So a lot of times we talk about buffers in the areas that we end up planting or restoring, but this is basically a buffer so that we're not just building a house right on the bank of that buffer or on that wetland. So in the figure, you can see the buffer or the wetland in the middle, and then that buffer outside where no new construction can occur. If something's already existing there, it usually stays there and doesn't have anything happen to it. If somebody wants to make an expansion and they're on that wetland buffer line, they tend to have to do the construction on the other side of the buffer. So that is at kind of that local level. Now, of course, talking about mandatory protection, lots of laws and regulations. There's a lot of situations where wetlands get a really bad name, and it's very understandable because wetlands can delay a project. It can cost a lot of money to put together a permit or hire somebody to do a wetland delineation or put together a mitigation plan. So wetlands do tend to take a little extra energy and resources. But one really amazing thing, and one thing that we really like to talk about here at the district, is the voluntary stewardship and the things that we can do in order to protect these wetlands that don't require that mandatory protection. And the first and foremost is awareness of water resources, whether it's streams or rivers or wetlands. And all of you here today, as part of that awareness, spreading the information about wetlands, what they are, why they're important. Another big part of voluntary stewardship is volunteering within your community or advocating within your community. I think communities have a lot of say and have a really good voice for really important topics. And so that's one way to get involved. Another thing is to stay up to date on local projects. There's a lot of information, especially if it's a very big project or depending on what type of permits is required. There sometimes are public comments for certain permits. And so staying up to date and knowing what to look for is also a really good way to know what's happening in our region. And then, of course, when we talk about voluntary stewardship, I put a plug in here for reporting that voluntary stewardship. If you are a landowner and you are doing really amazing conservation on your ground, we at the district are the lead for the Whitman County Voluntary Stewardship Program. So if you're a landowner and you're doing amazing things, reach out, because we really want to capture all of the amazing things that people are already doing here in our district. Another voluntary protection of wetlands are wetland easements. There's a handful of agencies that work with easements or provide money and support. And this is for private landowners who are interested in restoring or protecting bigger wetlands on their land. You do enter into an agreement with the agency, and it is a real estate transaction. So it's a really big easement and preserve that you are doing to that land. It can be permanent, or it could be a shorter term, depending on what the goals are of the landowner. And so this is a way to protect these resources on your land for future generations. And so now we're going to kind of transition into wetland restoration. Again, we're talking about improving degraded resources so that we can restore and enhance those functions. When we talk about wetland restoration, it could be reestablishment of a former wetland. So in this photo here, it looks like, you know, there was some hydrology and a wetland here before, but it wasn't really functioning. It wasn't doing or having those values that we see with really pristine wetlands. And so they put a project together to expand this wetland and restore those functions. And you can kind of see the progression here. But restoration can also mean the creation of new wetlands as well, and creating those types of ecosystems. So successful restoration projects, one of the most important factors, at least in wetland restoration projects, is the hydrology. And I go back to those three characteristics. Hydrology is that saturation or flooding on the land. It's creating these anaerobic conditions. And when you have hydrology, those soils and vegetation come to support that entire community. And so, you know, hydrology and having a way to reconnect the hydrology in your restoration project is super important. And so when we think about wetlands here on the Palouse, you know, there is some evidence that there were historically these wet meadows on the Palouse before settlers came. We know that there's a lot of Palouse prairie remnants in our region, and that we had these rolling hills of prairie, at least in our upland ecosystems, but also having some of those wet areas at those lower lying valleys. There's definitely some evidence there for that. We obviously have camas in this region, and camas is a plant that is typically found or is okay with being in wet areas. And so today's wetlands, they can be found as a small depression in a field. They could be a headwater or a spring. And they can be found along some of the river banks and are part of those floodplain areas as well. Another thing about Palouse wetlands is they can be seasonally wet. So water must be on a wetland for a certain amount of time for those anaerobic conditions to develop. And typically we don't think of wetlands being seasonally, but especially in this area, When we have kind of yearly fluctuations in precipitation and climate, it might be wet all year long if the hydrology is there, or it may dry up for a few months through those drier summer months as well. So just because a piece of land may dry up seasonally doesn't necessarily mean it's not a wetland. And unfortunately here, we do have a lot of wetlands that are dominated by the invasive reed canary grass, which creates a monoculture and doesn't have quite that diversity in plant vegetation or in vegetation that we like to see. So just a little tidbit on our Palouse wetlands and where they can be found and where they're located on our landscape. And when we think about these wetlands and the restoration steps, we are thinking about kind of these three main parts: restoring or keeping water within the area. Remember, the hydrology is super important. Increasing the native plant diversity. So planting into an existing wetland or ecosystem. And then adding habitat features to encourage habitat to return to these areas. And when we think about those steps here on the Palouse, that restoring hydrology connection, one of those ways would be to decommission a tile line. And I don't mean that in the sense of taking any agriculture out of production, but if you were to buy a piece of land and there was a lot of subsurface water due to tile lines and you wanted to restore that piece of land, you could decommission those tile lines to bring that subsurface water back up to the surface and have that hydrology. Another part to restoring hydrology on the Palouse is reconnecting floodplains. We have a lot of areas along our streams and rivers where we have really steep cut banks or bank erosion. And even at high flow, sometimes those rivers don't even get to those floodplains. So we have a little bit of a disconnect between our floodplains. And so one strategy to restoring hydrology would be trying to reconnect floodplains so the water and that energy can dissipate into wetlands within the floodplain. Establishing native plants, of course, again, we're talking about reed canary grass. And a lot of times what we do is try to mow the reed canary grass as much as we can and plant into it, sometimes using mulch fabric to try and keep that low and shaded. If you wanted to potentially take a step further and more intensive approach to restoration, we could try removing that top layer of soil to really try to cut back that reed canary grass and have kind of exposed soil for our native plants that we wanted to plant. And then of course, habitat, raptor poles, logs, brush piles, root wads, again, anything to entice these wetlands or entice wildlife back into our wetlands. They can add complexity to the ecosystem and provide a lot of shelter that's lacking currently in our wetlands. And then of course, the Natural Resource Conservation Service has national wetland practices. And you can see here again, restoration, enhancement, creation. There's even a practice for constructed wetlands. An example of that may be a wastewater treatment plant where they would like to use the function of a wetland in order to do a certain process. And so treating that wastewater and constructing wetlands in that situation is a kind of natural way to help filter water. But then you'll also notice that there are some practices here that specifically highlight wildlife and enhancing that habitat to bring back that habitat as well. And so I just wanted to touch base on successful restoration projects in general. And this goes for wetland projects, but it can be said about any of the projects that we work on the landscape and as a district. Successful restoration projects include intense planning, a really great design, accurate implementation of those practices, and then of course monitoring to see how those practices are doing on our landscape. For wetlands specifically, they tend to have to be multidisciplinary depending on the scale of the project. Engineers, biologists, geologists, all sorts of scientists coming together to share their technical knowledge to make that plan, to design that wetland. And so having more partners just allows us to have more successful projects. And then of course, this last point here is wetlands and water bodies are part of our landscape, and having a restoration project or plan that fits into the landscape, fits into a watershed plan is really important. The small projects that landowners do on their individual land is so important, but the network of projects that we do together collaboratively as a region has a really big benefit for water quality, soil health, and habitat. And so for successful restoration, and the way that we approach it is trying to restore a network of ecosystems. And so with all of that, I want to leave you just with a few take-home points. I talked a lot this evening about wetlands, and I hope these take-home points at least spark you to think about this or research more information about wetlands, or reach out because you want to talk more about wetlands. But I will leave you with these few points. Wetlands are diverse, they're found throughout the landscape, and they can be difficult to identify. They provide many functions and values that are important to the landscape and to people. Wetlands are protected. They do require permits, but they can be managed through the awareness of regulations and laws. PCD does not regulate wetlands. We love to provide technical assistance and restore wetlands, but we are not part of that regulation. And then, of course, conservation really has the ability to protect and restore these ecosystems and their functions across our entire landscape. So with that, I will take a break here and just open it up to questions from all of you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steph. This has been great. I think you got a lot of us with your "is it a wetland or is it not a wetland" quiz. So well done with that. So as a reminder, you're welcome to put your questions into the chat. You're also welcome to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask them to Steph directly. But the first question that came in, Nancy had a great question. She said, might the multidisciplinary restoration team also include educators and social scientists?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely, in my technical brain, was thinking about scientists and kind of more those technical sides, but you are absolutely right. Multidisciplinary takes into consideration education, outreach, It incorporates that monitoring, and it really is a conversation that usually starts at the landowner. What are they interested in doing? How do they want to protect these resources on their private property? And so I would even include them in that multidisciplinary team and stakeholders for these big restoration projects.
Awesome. Glad to hear it as an educator. It's good to hear we're part of the team. So someone asked, what are the best wetlands in Whitman County to visit?
Yeah, that is a really good question. Whitman County has a lot of private land. So I will give some ideas for you. PCEI did some work on what they call a state line wetland that is off of the Chipman Trail. And the Chipman Trail in general is a really great place for us, especially locally. There's a lot of restoration that's happened along the trail, some specifically on wetlands, some on riparian buffers. But I think that entire stretch in Idaho and Washington is just a beautiful place to go take a look at a landscape that multiple partners have been working to restore, and it's a great place to go birding and watch out for wildlife as well. And then, of course, this is not in Whitman County, but Turnbull is a really great resource for us around here to go and visit. And they definitely have wetland ecosystems that they've worked on and restored as well. And so that's a pretty close place for us to explore and see those regional wetlands.
Great, thank you. So George asked, has anyone made a map showing the difference between the waters of the United States and the Navigable Waters Protection Rule?
That is a very good question. I am not sure. I guess I should say that I am sure there is a resource out there to determine what is navigable, and then, the definition for waters of the US. Again, that definition does change and get tweaked periodically, but I don't know if there's an actual map or a tool for you to be able to explore that.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that. I apologize.
It's a good question. And then just, Zach also said in the chat that the PCEI Rose Creek Preserve is a really great place to go check out wetlands too. So great recommendation. We had a question, thinking of streams in the Palouse, would a wooded riparian area be considered a wetland? Or where is that distinguishing line between a wooded wetland and a non-wetland riparian area?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Floodplains, especially ones that are functioning very well, can be kind of hard to distinguish between a floodplain and a wetland. Typically, the soil and vegetation in those areas are just a little bit different to be able to designate between wetland. On top of that, you could have a wetland kind of in the river stream bed, depending on what the floodplain looks like. And so it is a very blurry line between floodplain and wetland. I would say that it does have to do with those characteristics. What do the soils look like? What type of wetland or what type of plants are there? Are they all wetland water-loving plants, or are they plants that tolerate some water every once in a while? I can speak from experience, and I have been in that situation of trying to determine if I'm in a floodplain or a wetland, and it can be very difficult because floodplains can be very braided with stream channels and wetlands.
Okay. That does sound quite complex. And then we also had a follow-up question. Is there any public geospatial data available for wetlands, more specifically GIS layers?
I believe that you can download data from the National Wetland Inventory database. I'm also sure that there is some mapping resource from agencies that have compiled at least partial data throughout the country. It might not necessarily include every area of the country, or it might just be certain states. I'm not exactly sure about a resource to point you in, but I bet you Fish and Wildlife Service has some spatial data out there that is free and available to public use.
Awesome, thank you. So I think that about wraps up the time we have for questions. So thank you so much, Steph, for your presentation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Really great information.
Thank you all for joining me today and letting me talk to you for a really long time about wetlands. And all of my information here is on the screen. It's also found on our website. If anybody has additional questions, if you have a wetland on your property and you want me to come just look at it, I am always happy to come do site visits and talk to people about the resources they have on their land.